this particular topic is like setting the baselines, which will be taken forth by all the other remaining topics. And a very important aspect to our study is identifying the existing gap. We're trying to follow a cyclic approach to the study, where psychology individually, architecture individually, and then perception of spatial variables, sort of, we play around with that and come up with different permutations and combinations and theories that imply for all of these.
This is basically one of the theories of the process that we came across when we were reading a paper on the space, where we found that how architecture or how a perception and architecture comes in place in one space together. If we just look at it, we're able to found that as in gestalt psychology, and what we perceive is very different, right? So we have a vision, we are seeing something in reality, but what we are perceiving is very different from it. And it actually forms in on the basis of our perception that is on the past, but also on the cognition space. Right? So this is basically a process that we found on the space of architecture and psychology. Me and Sharvari, we started breaking up the concept of psychology and architecture, making our own small checklists on how would we want to go ahead with the concepts and all of that. And slowly we realized that at the end of the day, you just be like architecture is getting break up, and we pick up the spaces of psychology, and then we get into the details from the different angles, divided that into spaces like perception, cognition, behavioral, emotional, and biological, and also another layer of demographic, how demographics plays a very different role on perception of a person.
Glenda and I, we are researching into spatial contexts and child psychology and how children interact with space and how that develops their perception and other cognitive functions. The age group we are focusing on is 0 to 4 years.
So what we are looking at is like 3 different stimuli we are considering that a child would interact with. Is one is like the physical realm, like then the virtual and the auditory.
As I mentioned earlier, the cognitive functions that we intend to look into are perception, memory, correlation, estimation, judgment, and abstract thinking.
Like for an example, bringing it all together, like I mean, in the previous presentation we heard about colors. So even here, while studying for trying to understand how children behave, there were studies that were done like for age groups, I think 2.5 years and above, where they saw like, okay, they put them in different colored rooms, like in white, red, blue, yellow, green, and what were the different emotions that came out, or like was there more cooperation or less cooperation, were they active, calm, angry, sad. So there are a few studies that kind of measure this. It's just one thing that we are comparing, but then there's also in terms of height, like ceilings that are like 8 feet and above or below 8 feet. So usually if the ceiling is 8 feet and above, children get a more open, because it's not a child scale, it's like much taller, so then they feel everything is big around them. But they also talk about like building things to the child scale, which is below 8 feet, and then it's like they're more calm and less active and more like cozy feeling.
As of now, we have a few questions that we think would help us in directing our research. So the first one was, do infants perceive space? Is perception of space something that is biologically inherent to us, or does it take place with experience? Then how is this process of perception of space and other spatial objects, how does it take place, at what age? Since we are focusing at the age group of 0 to 4, we wanted to study this again in a chronological order. And how does a child learn to perceive through things they interact with the most? And under this, we also wanted to look into preferences, how a child develops preferences for a particular space or a particular object. And lastly, how is perception of space shaped with the help of cartoons, stories, folklores, and lullabies? So yeah, the last is something that we are still working on. I think for us right now, it requires a little in-depth research, because there's no direct research to it. There's a lot of reading between the lines is what I think, and trying to form relations.
So the other concepts that we're trying to understand is like effects of like angular and curved interiors on their cognitive abilities, and differences between like outdoor and indoor. And then in terms of movement and circulation to space, like Michelle mentioned, like a corridor makes you feel like running, and if there's a ledge in an outdoor space, the child will automatically be like, oh, I want to like jump, stand on it and jump, kind of. So movement, circulation, and objects in these spaces, effects of color, and physical and non-physical senses and their role in perceiving spaces. For example, when we look at like cartoons, or cartoon would be something that they're seeing but it's not present, it's like they're visualizing it. But the non-physical space also, in terms of when say a mother is talking to a child and trying to describe something, what are they, how are their senses helping them perceive that image or a space of what is being told to them. And then role of symbolism and language in enhancement of perception, this is something that we need to still explore more, but something that we want to look into going ahead.
Perception being one of the major cognitive functions that we want to look into. As per the research we have gone through right now, perception starts right after birth, after a few days, in terms of perceiving objects. And the mother is the primary object for the child at that time. And for the child, the mother is, a source of pleasure in terms of gratification of needs, hunger, and discomfort when the child messes up and the mother comes and cleans the child. So gratification of needs is associated to the mother. And then if you go further into the Freudian theory, you see how the child also realizes that the mother is a separate entity, and the mother is not just there for the child. And that's when Freud talks about a lot of aggression that might take place in the child, because he or she realizes that the mother can sometimes go away as well. So at 18 months, the child learns how to differentiate between objects. For example, a phone is different from, let's say, a glass. But why is it different? That meaning and that analysis, it takes time to come in, and observation plays a great role. So like the child sees the parents talking over the phone, and that's when the child starts imitating using the phone, even though there is no phone call. But that's how the child understands the difference in the meaning, not just in how the child looks at it, but in the functionality as well. Dimension and aspects of shape is learned between the ages of 3 and 4. So before the dimensions and aspects are learned in detail, the child knows that a circle is different from a square. But why is it different? That is something the child may not be able to explain. But with time, as the child reaches the age of 3 or 4, there is certain level of understanding that develops as to what makes a circle different from a square. Now, concepts of sameness and congruence also develops in the same age group. Like for a child, a triangle and a sort of a kite shaped figure may be the same because they both have pointy tops, and a square that is straight and a square that is tilted may be different just because they're tilted.
So young children, basically they use and they develop these spatial concepts in terms of like location, relative position, symmetry, direction. But like going over the years, they understand it, the differences, but they don't know like the reason for it or the explanation. But they kind of like try and understand the difference. Basic concepts, spatial concepts is there. Some spatial skills and ideas are built into like human systems, like near and far. Like when a child is like playing, say it has certain things in front of it, so it will like, it won't know near and far and all. Maybe like some words it might know, but it just understands it in terms of like, okay, this object is like near me right now, but if I have to go to something else, I have to reach out to get to something. They don't understand depth, I guess, until like till you're 3 and above. There are studies that talk about if you tell a person that you're going to the park and you take one route which is like 10 minutes, they'll assume that it takes one amount of time. But if you take a detour, they will not realize that there's like a distance difference, but they'll just know that okay, the park means it's going to take this much time. Like they won't realize, oh, the route is different, you're caught up in like maybe traffic or something like that. And also they learn more like while they're crawling around and they walk around, and when they become aware of surroundings, like as they grow older, they understand like the use of objects, and then they like explore things obviously, and then like learn about symmetries and aesthetics. Also the importance of like outdoor spaces and nature, because most of the studies on the architectural side, I would say, is like we build all these structures assuming, thinking about like what we as adults would want and do and need. But as architects we build for the end user, but when we're building for kids, I don't know how much input do we take from them that this is what a kid would want and need, like in their spaces. So again, we build it according to our perception of like this is what a child would need. The thing about architecture is once it's built, it's kind of fixed. There's no exploration, or there is no modification or something where the child can be like, no, I don't want this here, I want to change this space the way it is. Whereas that freedom is, I mean, they get that freedom more in the outdoor spaces as compared to indoors. That's why like there is always a need for outdoor spaces, so that there is less restrictions on what they can do and can't. It stimulates their brain more and like gets them more active and interactive in things.
I have a question. What you said, Linda, does it mean that a 3 or a 4-year-old child would be capable of understanding the change it requires in an indoor space, in his or her own room? He might not know that he wants something different, but in a park, because he has the various options, he has a sand pit, he has a swing, he has a slide, wherever, he knows that he does not want to go to the swing and he wants to go to the slide. But wouldn't he also know the same thing in his own interior space as well?
So what I'm trying to say, basically, there are, based on the studies, what they say is like the greenery, the nature, the natural environment kind of stimulates them to kind of explore more or gives them more room to adapt. It was a study done for pediatric wards, and they say like because in a pediatric ward there are certain things that are there, like your beds and your all your machines. But then for a child to recover faster when you put them in an outdoor space, like first of all, there's natural light and things like that. Like there's no your light is not controlled. It's like how I guess humans were used to being in an outdoor space.
So we're
I guess
basically
there is,
talking about green elements being more supportive for a child, right? Like being a lot better in terms of an environment as compared to a built environment. Is that what we're saying?
yeah, I mean, it's not, I think it's not just green, but also your air. It's not like a ventilator, like all those kind of natural elements.
And the concept of free will, it's more prevalent in an outdoor space, because if you go by like humanistic psychology, humans are seen as people of free will. So that free will for a child can be better exercised in an outdoor space where it seems limitless, it seems like boundless, but a room or a building or a structure kind of restricts the child from exercising that free will to a certain extent.
While he's exercising his free will, he's also putting himself at the risk of anything happening, right? So I wouldn't know why a child would want to be more outdoor than indoor in his
Because I
comfort.
don't think that a child understands the concept of safety as much as adults. A child doesn't have a concept of danger and safety. It is something that we teach to a child. That is why you teach a 3 or 4-year-old ki now you've begun walking. You cannot just accept candy from anyone, or you cannot just hold anyone's hand and start walking away with them. But this is something that you have to teach the child, right? You have to inculcate it in the child. It's not inborn. It's not inherent.
Right. Also, at some point, I think William Wundt has said that the child does not perceive given situations as they actually exist, but under the prejudice of his own interest. So, if that is true, from where is he getting these interests? I mean, he's already a child. He's just born. Like, he's probably like a year old. If he's not perceiving what is in front of him, where are these interests coming from? Is my question.
Curiosity? I don't know. This is the question. Is it curiosity, Michelle?
But I think it's also like we mentioned, as they grow old, as they start learning to crawl and walk, and as they explore more, they kind of see more. So the more you're exposed to these different environments, you kind of then you be like, oh, this was better than the previous. Or I guess that is somewhere where like, I mean, so everything we do is something that we've experienced, right? Like everything we are, even examples or we talk is something that we've experienced somewhere.
Yeah, as you said, you spoke about William Moon. There's also an interesting example on this. Like, obviously, now me or even Glenda would not be able to tell you why a child and how a child perceives, because a child knows that. But there was an Indian architect, I forgot his name, a very famous architect, and he said that if you want to build creative designs, you look at the designs a child would build for a house. And if you see, there would be the craziest of designs, but the child would functionally explain each and every concept of that design. So, and like similarly, even when a child reads, or if you when a child listens to a story, he has his, she has their own crazy imagination going on in their head. And if you look at the way children draw some things, they are not something, or even in pretend play, when they use a object that is completely unrelated to mimic another object, there is no limit at that time. They are not taught that this is right, they are not, or this is wrong. So I feel they have the space and the creativity to go as far as they would like. It is only after, formal education and society and stuff, that they are sort of restricted to think in a particular way, to be molded in a particular way. Now, there needs to be a lot of research, again, based on assumptions as to why or how these perceptions take place.
I mean, it's scary to know that as an architect, I have that much control over a child's life.
Yeah.
Like, shit, I better be designing something good.
I think all architects need to realize this, that we have, and it's not just a child's life, right? Like as we proceed with the topics, we realize what kind of a hold we have on all humans' lives. That's the purpose of the book. So,
Like
Nikita,
something
we're having an
as-
existential crisis over
something as simple as a window or a light bulb in a certain place can change the whole the entire way a child thinks. So yeah, perception, again, like as I was saying, it's
Big
sort of
problem.
built into the human perceptual system as well, and it's not unique to humans. If you look into it, even animals perceive. Like my cat knows a box is different from a table because as soon as she sees a box, she jumps into it. But the ability to perceive beyond that and to be able to express the differences, that is where language comes in, and that is what makes humans surpass animals in terms of perception.
Cultural directives are directives that work as recommendations or suggestions for people of certain communities across the globe to achieve a certain quality of life. It can be quite suggestive in nature, and different countries have different cultural directives. So basically, we're looking at how architecture affects psychology or influences psychology, and vice versa, under the influence of the culture of respective countries. Started off with the identification of the various cultural directives of countries, also studying the parameters, after which the reviewing the same from the architectural and psychological point of view through the literature review. And these have been done on three levels, so individual, immediate circle, and the community level. And then for an in-depth perspective, which would be the work that we will be following, we will be starting now after this, the way forward would be an in-depth perspective through a survey or interviews with experts or like psychologists, architects, designers, or surveys with individuals, if possible, from different cultures in the study. And we will be comparing and discussing the same. The major questions that will arise would be that why some parameters are considered in the respective culture and some are not, and the architectural construct influencing the psychological construct of communities across the globe and vice versa.
So the methodology that we are working with is, first we are identifying the cultural directives of different countries. We have explored most of them. Certain countries do not have such directives, so we are working with only a few.
And from the cultural perspective, the crux of the research till now that we have understood is that Vastu Shastra is a directive which is mostly applied in the tropical region of the Asian subcontinent on various levels, like the individual level, and spaces have been mentioned here, and the effect of those spaces being put in different directions on a person. And accordingly, the immediate circle, so how it balances the good and bad of the environment in a house. So the immediate circle around the family would be to look at how the rooms are placed across the cardinal directions.
I'm not sure about other parts of India, but at least where I'm from, in Telangana and Andhra, people are following Vastu to a nauseating point, to a point where like you cannot put a step without following Vastu. In big, large scale commercial projects, you cannot live without Vastu. So having like come from that space, do we know why we're doing this in the first place? As in, I know that I have to have my southwest block as the tallest, biggest, heaviest block. I don't know why. So I'm just asking you guys, do we know why we have to do that, or we don't know why we have to do it?
Like I mentioned, on an individual level, the table that I showed there, it talks about effects that it would have on a person. Usually we say that put the kitchen in the southeast, and scientifically we have found that we usually put that place, that area in the southeast side, because when the sun path of the Indian subcontinent, it usually follows from east to west and it tilts towards the south. The southeast sun rays would be quite good for the healthy conditions of the kitchen. People have tried to justify with a scientific justification behind where these things have to be put. Yes, it started with a religious kind of like a basis, but now people have tried to give scientific background to it.
When we talk about heritage architecture, we're talking about the intersection between evolutionary biology, culture, architecture, of course, and psychology. So it is the intersection of all of these fields where we find a story as to how human beings came from the forest and came onto the mainland and realized that okay, maybe building spaces and houses and subsequently bigger structures and places, and why this particular timeline that corresponds with this progression of built structure, and that corresponds itself to an evolutionary perspective, is how we kind of went about it. Then coming to an idea of the different types of dwellings, which are additives and subtractive dwellings. So from a point of view of caves and digging into spaces where people would hide themselves, and then coming to a point in the timeline of biology and evolution where they would start building things. So creating a house using certain materials like clay or ferns or sticks and many other materials. And finally, from the perspective of evolution, there are many theories that try to explain how the brain raised its capacity and how humans became so intelligent. But certainly, you will find that it is correlated to the aspect of inhabiting a place and this change of hunter gatherer lifestyle to into a sedentary lifestyle. The type of dwellings that we find are semi-permanent dwellings, and since that was a nomadic culture, we find that culture was not very materialistic, and also the environment that they built was controlled by very spiritual entities rather than physical entities. So, when we look at the psychological implications, we are going to firstly talk about a sense of community. When it comes to these kind of settlements, especially from the Neolithic age, the idea is their relationship with their environment is very, very rooted, deeply rooted in respect for nature, respect for culture. So now we come to the timeline of from 10,000 BC to the 3000 BC, where humans began to settle into different civilizations. So the first evidence of civilization that we have found is in the Henan province of China, that is the Jiahu culture. And we can also find that most of the dwellings that existed across all civilizations were in the form of circular or rectangular forms with thatched roofs and mud plaster. So that we can find evidence that across all areas, human beings used to reside into similar kind of dwellings. And then the idea of cities began to emerge, where a large group of people would gather at a similar place. We come on to the Mesopotamian civilization, which is one of the most important civilization and marked as the birth of civilizations. So the most famous form, the architectural form that emerged in this period was the form of ziggurat, which were step terraces shaped like a pyramid, which were used as foundations for religious places. Interestingly, we also see some other architectural milestones coming up, but from the psychological perspective, we see the lack of complete experimentation in this front. So Shulgi's wall was this one wall which was built and it was actually not connected to any surrounding space for the police, and this particular wall is just is this isolated wall in front of the palace. So it is only after this particular, which is also supposed to be the one of the first kinds of walls that came up, and is still remains. So we see that people slowly started to develop things in terms of their needs, but were yet to actualize it in the sense of what is its efficacy. Moving on.
Egyptian civilization, where we all know the famous pyramids of Giza have been constructed. The form of a pyramid is also considered to be the most stable of the geometrical forms. The material that was used was for building of the pyramids was also the most durable material that we know, that is the stone.
When we talk about heritage architecture, I think Great Pyramid of Giza is like one of the first things that comes to a lot of us, apart from maybe the Taj Mahal, which would be in our subsequent part of a research. But I think the main question comes is, why is it so significant for us, right? Why is it that when we try to think of heritage and we think of our history as an entire species, this is one site that really has left behind a huge impact? And the answer lies in the study of aesthetic trinity theory. So there are three aspects to this. First is the aesthetic awe, second is the state of being moved, and the third is the experience of thrills and chills. So this is actually scientific, this is a study, and these three dimensions will explain to us as to why the Great Pyramid of Giza actually garners this kind of excitation from us. And the pyramids of Giza are a typical prototype sublime stimuli. In psychological research, a subliminal stimulus is a kind of stimulus wherein it may be perceived and processed in the brain, but may not elicit a reaction or awareness in your conscious brain. So even when you think that it doesn't really mean a lot to you, it actually does. On a subconscious level, you are interpreting it as something really great, or something that's of impact. And Jungian psychologists use the pyramid shape to illustrate development of the human psyche from immaturity to maturity. So from that, I think we can understand as to why this particular pyramid structure has such a connection with, in terms of sacred geometry, in terms of leaving a very very great impact on our mind. So interesting thing that I came across in my research when reading about this, Carl Jung took a huge interest in Vastu Shastra and Vedic scripture and knowledge. And the similarity is that both refer it to as a system of the representation of universe. Now, when we talk about Vastu, we're talking about energies, we're talking about the configuration of the energies, like it was previously discussed. Same can be compared as the Jung's archetypes. So basically, the difference is that Jung primarily uses it to explain and understand the wholeness of self, as in the parts of ourselves that maybe comes from the pre and antecedents, and Vastu, which is also an interpretation of the energies that correlate itself to the universe in terms of the stars, and translating it to our present self. And Jung would address the psychological aspects of the archetype of home, family, and father, etc., and ask the users to create mandalas to understand how they feel, or any other spiritual technique. So while Vastu would check the existing plan and analyze it based on the mandala to understand where the energy problems would lie. So this is like a comparison of the Jungian archetypes and mandalas and Vastu.
We can start from the 1600 basically. We don't need to go before that. Interior design was not a full-fledged concept before that. We can start from the 1600s. And essentially how I've gone about this is, there's a period. So it's either a movement, an art movement, a social movement, a war. There is a period. It has a time period. There are these characteristic interior design features that I can pull out from that period, and there are some very specific causes for those characteristics or influences for those characteristics. So if I'm going to, for example, talk about my Baroque, so where a Baroque came from, which is a very flamboyant, overachieving, extra sort of design, it came from a very religious place. So it came from the Catholics trying to reform their whole like religion, and they were like, okay, no, we're going to brand ourselves completely differently, and now we're going to go and do this extravagant thing and look all high-fi. So the Rococo Baruch was actually a response to Baruch, because what happened in the political scene was the kings changed. So when one king left and then the throne went to the successor decided, I don't like that style at all. I'm going to completely change that style. It honestly came from a place of like ego and wanting to have my own mark. Industrial revolution was a huge one. So suddenly now, when industrial revolution happened, which is after the 1760, that period, we had all of these new materials enter our world. So we had iron and steel and all of these new materials that people didn't really use before this. Then we come to like this Victorian time period. Now this is interesting for us is because it tells us a lot about our gender roles. This was honestly the first time where I think women were allowed to come into the picture and talk to each other and be like, no, I want my kitchen like this, or I want my design to look like this. And the men were frankly not threatened by this concept, because they were like, okay, so whatever these women are doing, they're doing it inside the four walls of their house, so it's fine. So if my wife wants to play like decorator and she wants to dress up our kitchen, I don't have a problem with it. So this is where women started coming into the picture. They started deciding what colors would look nice, and floral patterns and all of these things started coming into picture then. And also with that came into the picture mainstream media. The average height of a woman is 5'5" or 5'4" or even less. The average height of a man is much taller, obviously. But why are cabinets traditionally designed so high that we can't even go to take things on our own? So, who on earth decided that in time saver standards we're going to put up like cabinet heights at this height that nobody can access without a stool or without the help of a man who's much taller? This was the period where people kind of started questioning things. They were experimenting with different type of materials, handicrafts or like minimalism style. So this is like 1900 and postmodern, and I guess modern, which is now, is a bit of a confusing period, because now we've reached the world of, now by now I mean 1980s to now. So now we've reached a world where we have something called AutoCAD. We have 3D models that get generated in seconds. And we have these fixed designs, fixed patterns, fixed everything that we kind of pick up and place. So, along with having a lot of these things, we also want to do very creative things, very different things. But then we also like to rely on our tried and tested methods, any of the older methods that we know that work, that are good,
Urban
Victorian
planning
methods
on
that we
mental
do
health.
that.
First, we want to establish the premise for both the topics that we are venturing into. First is what is urban design. It is basically is concerned with the arrangement, appearance, and function of our suburbs, towns, and cities. It is both a process and an outcome of creating localities in which people live, engage, and the physical place around them. It determines the physical scale, space, ambience of a place, and establishes the built, unbuilt, and natural forms within and around it, which network, system, and relationships where can occur.
Now we'll be talking about mental health. And as per the definition given by the World Health Organization, we know that mental health is a state of well being in which an individual realizes his or her own abilities. They can cope with the normal stresses of life and can work productively and contribute positively to their society or to their community. Mental health also allows us to be productive. It allows us to interact with other people and to earn a living and enjoy our lives. And on this basis, the promotion, protection, and restoration of mental health can be regarded as a vital concern for all of us. Here, you can see that I have put promotion and restoration in bold because these are the two main aspects of which we can see the effect of urban planning on mental health. For example, let's talk about this the intersection of urban design and mental health. On the intersection lies the human beings. And through these points, we'll be looking at how urban design and mental health actually intersect together. For example, let's think of green space and access to nature. We know that people who have access to green spaces or who have access to nature report better well-being. For example, there was a study done in the 1960s where two groups of women were compared. In the first group of women, there were only people who could look at only concrete jungles out of their windows, like they did not have access to any sort of green space or nature. On the other hand, there was a group of women who had regular access to nature. It was found that the first group reported worse mental health as compared to the second group, which also proves that green space and access to nature has a good impact on our well-being. Imagine walking through a street where there are very tall buildings and you don't find anybody on the street, or even if you look up you see that all of the windows are closed. So there is this concept of eyes on the street. How do you build a street or a road where there is more visibility on the road? For example, you put a lot of windows in a particular building so that people always think that somebody is always looking at me, right? So it prevents people from causing harm to other people.
Our idea was that, when we talk about urban design, it's not exactly just about the physical infrastructure that is manifested, but also how people experience those spaces. So it's very important that the kind of space you're in, it creates an impact. The first thing that you do in a space is you visualize it, or you look at it and then you have a feeling about it. The other is that how accessible it is. We create notional and even physical boundaries, demarcations that can happen, and how easier it is to access makes a lot of difference. Visibility, we are considering as a macro scope where, we have a perception for each space.
So we are looking at environment, we're looking at built versus unbuilt spatial context, transportation, urban and rural development, as well as some other broader spatial context. So there is this theory known as the biophilia theory, which states that humans have an innate need to connect to nature, and humans also have an innate need to connect to other species, right? We have also seen that green and blue space have a restorative effect. When we say restorative effect, it means that it facilitates attention without even trying, even when you're not trying to concentrate on a particular thing.
For example, if we consider Mumbai, so there's Dharavi, and besides that, only there's skyscrapers. So there's a sense of privacy that's created because of the physical infrastructure that exists in the society. There are notional demarcations where, due to people's behavior, the kind of society that lives there also creates a sense of enclosure. The second part that we'll be considering is the type of housing, which is where do people move, how do they move, which spaces do they like to engage with versus which places they don't, and the density itself.
So when we talk about cognitive overload and urban stress, we know that people who live in urban environments, they're constantly over bombarded with a lot of stimuli. And all human beings have a limited cognitive capacity to process information. And when this information that is coming from the environment exceeds their capacity to process, it causes cognitive overload. Something to note over here is that when it comes to transportation and when it comes to basic navigation in a city or in any place, humans build a cognitive mapping, or they build a mental map of the space that they are residing in or they are navigating through. So how do urban designers plan a space where mental mapping does not require a lot of cognitive capacity of an individual? That is also something that we are looking into. Now, to talk about ecological theory, in ecological theory, Bronfenbrenner talked about four basic systems: the microsystem, mesosystem, exo, and the macrosystem. So the microsystem is the immediate environment of the user. It's the home, school, office, etc. Mesosystem is the interaction between the immediate environment. Exosystem is the places that we don't interact with directly, like the neighborhood or the community spaces. And macrosystem are the policies or the economic frameworks, as well as the cultural frameworks. Why is this important over here? Because if we take an example of a child living in a rural area as compared to a child living in an urban area, and think of their school. If their school is a microsystem, think of the relationship that they have between their school as well as their home. For example, a child who lives in an urban environment does not take a lot of time to travel between their home and school. But a child who's living in a rural environment takes a lot of time to travel in between, and how they're traveling is also an important part. If you think about their neighborhood might have very different aspects. For example, a child living in a rural area might have more safety as compared to a child living in an urban area. So this is something that was pointed out by research, that if we take ecological theory into consideration, then children living in rural areas or children living in urban areas have different learning capacities.
There was a quote by Winston Churchill, which I'm remembering, which is, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. When Sparsh and Neha, they were talking about graveyards, I thought that there again, how we perceive the green space, that is important, because here I see people doing picnics in graveyards, because that is not a graveyard, not a kikkergard for us. We call it kikkergard in Danish, but it's more like an open green space where you just hang out. So for me, that was really like astonishing at first. Okay, so they're just partying in a graveyard, but that is how it is here. So how you perceive that open space, that green space, that also depends a lot on how you engage and interact with it.
So, what is an experimental architecture? Experimental architecture explores new paths and imagines new ways to meet the needs and challenges of humans in relationship to the natural world. Architectural experiment could be based upon the shapes, the materials, the planning principles, the experimental usage, and also the construction methods. So, what we basically did was we analyzed structures based upon the architecture. And the main intent of the architect here was to create a confusion or chaos, a kind of confusion as how it is to depict the Jewish history then during that time. The entire museum is more a experience of spaces as how it was during that time. It's more of an experimental space. With coming on to the spaces, once you descend from the Berlin Museum to the Jewish Museum, we just come across these three axes. These three axes are the main axes of circulation. There's one axis which leads up to the gallery. The other one is a Holocaust tower, and the other one is a Garden of Exile. All these are different kind of experimental spaces, to bring in different kind of emotions within people. There are two staircases, as I said. The one which is used as the entrance staircases from the Berlin Museum to the Jewish Museum. The other one is a staircase which leads up to the permanent museum. Approach from the entrance staircase, it's a flush approach, so it is not so visible, and the form of the staircase is, in both the cases, it is enclosed, and it is all straight staircase. Entrance staircase is narrow and deep, and it goes down 3 floors to the basement. In contradictory to the staircase of continuity, it goes up 3 floors to the permanent museum there.
So if you look at the entrance staircase, it's narrow and deep. There's a theory called perspective theory, and according to it, for a building to be perceived as aesthetic, there needs to be a balance between its perspective effect and refuge effect. So perspective effect exists when our view of the surroundings is unobstructed and we are trying to explore it further, and there's more refuge. It looks like a shelter, like the structure it resembles some kind of shelter. That's when a building is high on refuge. And for it to be aesthetic, there needs to be balance between the perspective aspects of it and the refuge aspect of it. If you look at the entrance, since it's narrow and deep, there's high prospect because there's unobstructed view of the surroundings and the person is free to explore it, which can lead to high fear. And as far as the staircase of continuity is concerned, it's narrow and steep, so it can create a feeling of refuge, which will lead to low fear. As far as the color is concerned, the entrance staircase, it's black and white in color. The walls are black and white basically. So this can create a visual contrast, and when there's this kind of visual contrast, it polarizes our moral judgment. So when you're first entering the museum and you see these black and white walls, it can instantly lead you to be extremely horrified at the experience of the Jews because you have such polarized moral opinions. Also, for the material, if you look at the entrance staircase, it's simple, but staircase of continuity, there'll be beams.
As you see in the entrance staircase, you have violent sharp angles with the materials used are very raw with rustic finish, and then you have all these mesh kind of raw materials which are being used, and it is totally not lit. Just the handrails here are inlet. So that is the only source of light which is coming onto the staircase here. When compared to the staircase of continuity, which you see it on the other side, on the right side, you do have upper windows there. So you do have lots of light and coming here, but beams are spanning across, not in a very uniform manner. It is in a random manner. The beams are spanning across. So it kind of gives you a crumbling kind of feeling or feeling of fear. And then with the staircase of continuity again, picture below, one more stairway which leads nowhere. So this probably the architect's intent was here to create a confusion in the mind, wherein this end is a dead end. So it's of no purpose there, and they'll have to come all the way down to just go back to the permanent museum there. With regard to the axis form, again, it's enclosed. The walls of the axis is all white and black ceiling. All the axes have the same kind of architectural properties with no windows, and they are all visually disconnected. There's no connection, and the only connection we have is in the axis of ale, where you have a glass door which opens to the garden of ale, but again that glass door just provides only visual connectivity, that's all. Axis of Holocaust leads into a Holocaust tower. So this tower it's again pentagonal in shape. It's a vacuum space wherein you don't have any light coming into it except for the skylight, a streak of light coming into it, and the size is 27 meters and for all this the material is again raw concrete.
Yeah, so there's no sound or light coming in, which can create sensory deprivation, except that one hole from where a stream of daylight is coming in. This can be symbolic to hope, because that was the only thing that kept the Jews going, this ray of light amidst the dead end. And daylight has been associated by symbolic meanings of cleanliness, purity, knowledge, and heaven. Also, the sensory deprivation, it can lead to feelings of oppression and anxiety. But the ray of light, it sees how even amongst all of this, the only ray of light that the Jews had.
I think I don't have any comments except that I have been to the Jewish Museum in Poland, Warsaw, and all that you ladies have mentioned here, it looks the same, almost felt the same for me, because yes, as we are talking about architecture, experimental architecture, there again the museum is called the Museum of Life, because therein through architecture they try to give you an insight into the life of the Jews, the history of
idea that such work happens to activate the unconscious mind through the imagery. So this is how any architecture or any work that has been done so far. The advocates, the ones who support surrealism, say that it's because of it's basically a reflection of whatever is there in their unconscious. And to be very honest, there is not a lot of work done in this area, and we are going all creative and trying to build this topic, incorporating ideas that share the notion of surrealism. So to delve deeper and understand surrealism even better, we started off with Kafka. The title is basically Kafka's blackest work. It is considered to be that. There are a number of interpretations to it, but here, obviously, we are going to focus on the spaces that he has created and what kind of an impact that has on the mind, or how people are perceiving when they are reading Kafka. So our plan is basically to make sketches. Architects on the team would come up with sketches on the different spaces that have been written by Kafka. And the work of a psychologist on the team would be to interpret and analyze as to how these spaces, the color pattern, the way it is drawn, everything, how that is impacting the mind. But from a psychological perspective, it really looks as if it does depict that one scene from Kafka's trial. It was a courtroom scene where, you feel very hopeless. It as if, like, for someone who has been falsely accused of some crime, it's this whole courtroom situation, or the law premise itself is very hopeless. Like, you can never just come out of it. And that's what the sketch also kind of represents, that there's no ending to it. It's like a loop. you come back and forth all over to it back and again. And this sketch also gives a hopeless and dark vibe as it is. Architectural developments that we've been experiencing in the recent times, we see a lot of new technology coming in. And the technological associations or the origin behind this technology has a lot to do with both the aspects, where people are trying to directly involve the psychological associations and respond to the psychological expectations when people enter a certain building, and also from the point of view where they're not concerned with ecology, they are bringing in technology. But nevertheless, they're just bringing in new technology. But nevertheless, there are psychological associations of all of those two approaches. And this research exercise is trying to explore those. So there are different types of technological advances that we're seeing in this contemporary architectural time, and those include kinetic architecture, parametric architecture. Then not exactly directly the type of architecture, but tools such as 3D printing and virtual reality, augmented reality, where we can see these aspects in different industries and different sectors. But in terms of architecture, where has it been used, and where it is heading, and what kind of psychological impacts are we expecting, is what I'm trying to research through this exercise. This list of different types of technological advances is not exhaustive, neither it is comprehensive of all the different types of technological associations that we can see. But through this list, I am going to try to expose myself to the technological and psychological interdependence. But to begin with, I started with kinetic architecture, and since we have two arms to this, psychology and architecture, and before we start merging these two to understand and get a grip of the topic that we actually want to look into, first is the process of understanding architectural technology in itself, because the technology is new, the research is new, and in the core understanding of these, the type of architecture itself is where the associations will start popping up. So to talk about the origin of kinetic architecture, it was kinetic architecture. First of all, is architecture that deals with movement. So we're talking about buildings which have certain elements which are rotating, moving, sliding, etc. So the origin of kinetic architecture has to do with the intent where people were trying to deal with a changing climate, and because of that, the changing expectations. Buildings were designed in a manner where they would create different situations and respond to the needs of the people. And despite that, while that was the origin point, today we see where kinetic architecture is being employed to cater to aesthetic aspirations, cater to the sheer desire to explore the extent of technology that we can bring into architecture. So the characteristics have to do with being responsive, being flexible, being adaptive to the context, and it kind of triggers the shift from survival to desire. So we started out with architecture. When we started out with shelter, we were majorly concerned about protecting us. We were majorly concerned about protecting us from the different factors that we were exposed to. But today, our desire, our outlook, or the way we look at architecture has shifted to more than that. We're trying to look at it from the aesthetic point of view, from the associations that we build with it, from that point of view as well. So because of that, kinetic architecture is something that is becoming a tool to address all these improved desires. And yes, reinvention of a space is something that kinetic architecture does also try to get into. So all of these are very architectural, like purely architectural features or aspects of kinetic architecture that I'm looking at. But yes, kinetic architectural applications include both pragmatic and humanistic, where in terms of pragmatic, the uses vary from changing the organization of space and changing the use of space to humanistic aspects, where we're trying to cater to changing environmental factors, and we are trying to cater to changing psychological expectations. So if we talk about, if in a smaller scale I'm supposed to present an example, then we can say a partition which opens up and creates and converts a room into a living space. So in that sense, the applications of kinetic architecture both vary from pragmatic to humanistic applications. Then comes the structural typologies, where we have structures which are somewhere between an installation and architecture, and we also have structures which are kinetic structures which are deployable, which are dynamic in different ways. So all of these are structural typologies of kinetic architecture, and these
do like these surely does have an impact in terms of the psychological responses, and they trigger certain psychological responses. But to begin with, I'm trying to look at them in an isolated manner of the technology of it, and not so much the psychology. Different types of design elements which are used to cause movement and motion into these buildings. So there are different examples where active control is used, and technology, I mean, computation is used to trigger these changes. At other times, the sheer geometry or unit in repetition and all of these different aspects are used as design elements where movement is achieved in structure. Some more examples of how movement is achieved in kinetic architecture through adaptable furniture, through adaptable design elements, through adaptable architectural elements, all of those walls, facades, etc.
To analyze materials, we used few parameters. So on the top of the whole chart, we have used category of materials, as in, is it a building block or a concrete type or a natural material. Then on the sub level, we have divided the material into its manufacturing details, life cycle, performance, and features, cost, pros and cons. So under manufacturing details, we have looked into its location and the whole manufacturing process. And under ingredients, we try to find whether it is made from from scratch new material, or is it made from something which is recycled or upcycled. Then in the other factor, life cycle, uh, first we looked into its whole lifespan, like up to like how many years it will be able to stay strong or the way it is. And the other factor is, after completing its lifespan, how it's going to lead, how it's going to lead further. Is it recyclable or biodegradable? Then, in terms of performance and features, how is it resistant to like fire, water, sound, and thermal variations? Then its porosity and weight. Weight actually will decide how it will be in the site it will be used, whether human will be able to lift it or cranes will be used to lift material. Then cost is important to consider, because cost will eventually decide that who will be the end user of the material. If it's too expensive, it is not for the poor, and if it is too cheap, the high class society is not going to accept that material.
Okay, so when we talk about material experience, like the psychological impact of it, so honestly, we do not have much in terms of like evidence about like how it impacts people. So like when we talk about materials, it's often in terms of its functions and is it sustainable or not. And even when we do talk about the psychological aspects of it, it is limited to natural materials in the context of biophilic design, like things like wood and stone. So there's not like much about how people experience materials in general. So why do we need to even look at materials beyond their functional and technical properties? So we can think of materials as symbols, just like words are symbols. They're used to communicate a message, and in the same way, architects use materials to convey different messages. They're like literally the building blocks for your what you're trying to convey to the user, what you're trying to express. So in that way, like you could have the same building, and if you make it with different materials, it's going to have a different impact. So the whole idea of this is to understand how can we more mindfully use materials to tailor them to specific context and to specific users, so that we can convey our message in a more accurate way. Let's say. So for this, we can look at it from this framework. So if you look here, the material experiences in the middle. So this is actually not from architecture, but this is from product design. They look into how different materials create different experiences, say for things like hair dryers and all of that. So we can look at material experience in terms of three things. So one is the actual material, and it's so in the material we look at the sensory properties, like is it rough, is it smooth, is it transparent, and all of that, and how those sensory properties lead to certain experiences. And then there's also the technical aspects of it, like Shivani was talking about. Its insulation properties influence the temperature of the space. It's up, and again about acoustics and all of that. So how do those impact you? And then the next one is the product. So we don't use materials in their raw form. We use it in certain products, and here the product would be the building. So the material is interpreted in different ways in different contexts. So the same material when it's used in a hospital setting is going to be different from when it's used in, say, a recreational setting like a game room or something. And also there are other things like the visual complexity that the material is used, like in the context, like how complex the material looks like. So those all have an impact on how we experience it. There's also like the manufacturing process it goes to. The same material can have different appearances based on that. So those all come under product. And the last one is the user. So obviously the user is going to be using the material. So their factors also influence it. For example, there was this study about how people who rate themselves as being warm, they tend to choose wood because it is also perceived as being warm. So that is one thing. And then there's this idea of nature relatedness. So this is again from biophilia. So this looks at the extent to which people think that, like believe that they are a part of nature. So it can be at different levels. So one person could think that humans are a complete part of nature and that we're equal to it. And another person might think that we are a part of nature, but we are above it and we need to protect it more. And then there could be someone who thinks that we are not really a part of nature and we, are supposed to dominate it and use it for our purposes. So how would that create different experiences of natural materials? So I'll just start with talking about natural materials in general. So often when we talk about material experience, it's about natural materials. So why is it that we talk about natural materials so much? So if you look at biophilia, we again say that we have a preference for natural materials. So there could be a lot of reasons for that. So one is that natural materials are rooted in the local and cultural context. So they are from that place. So they belong to that area and it creates a sense of belongingness and all of that. And the other way we could look at it is that natural materials often, no, it's not limited to them, but they often are viewed as having a more personality and they have a history, because if you take a piece of wood or bamboo, it's not going to be the same. The different pieces of bamboos are going to be different. They have a different history, they have different personality and appearance. But usually when we look at contemporary materials like concrete, it's usually made in a manufacturing area and it does not really have a personality. But again, that depends on how we use it.
Okay, so the next material is glass, and it is considered as inorganic material. So the basic glass is made from silica. Next, alternative materials, like which is contemporary material, is aluminum glass. So there is, with some changes in manufacturing process, the aluminum is turned into transparent aluminum, which can be treated in the place of glass.
So in terms of how glass affects the space and our perception of it, I think glass is very interesting for that, because glass can have a really powerful effect on a space. So if you look at glass as a material, it is ambiguous in nature. It is something that's transparent, but at the same time it's solid. You can connect with the outside world, but at the same time you're protected from it. So there's that aspect to it. And usually when we think of glass, we can think of things like how in display cases we have things in glass. Also in like shop windows, we use glass to display things. So there's this association that whatever is behind glass is of value. But even though technically glass isn't the strongest material to protect something, but we still use that. So it kind of teases you with that object, but you cannot really reach it. And it's also we can look at it as being associated with power. And another more practical aspect of glass is it allows light to pass through. And this again has like practical uses, like daylight is very beneficial for mental health. A more symbolic way to look at light would be how it has been used in certain places of religion. So, for example, in the Gothic architectures where they use tinted glass, so light is seen as a symbol of purity, and we use glass to let light in.
So wood is harnessed from wood, and it is biodegradable and recyclable, and it is widely used in the places which are prone to earthquake. But it needs extra treatment to be resistant against fire, water, termite attack, and it is affordable according to the location. If it, if there is a if there is a forest near the site, then obviously wood is affordable for you. But you if live in a total urban area, then it might not be feasible to build with totally timber. So the bamboo is a kind of glass, and it actually grows 1 meter per day. And bamboo construction is not easy. Actually, it requires a high skilled level of workers, and before construction it goes through a whole lot of treatment process, because there is some sticky material inside bamboo shoot which attracts all kind of termites and insects which can eat bamboo from inside. So it will look all right, like it will look fine from the outside, but from inside it is like totally hollow, and it won't be able to support the structure. And it is low cost, and it is good for the places having higher earthquakes, and it is lightweight. But the problem with bamboo is that there is lack of building codes in various countries. So the next is cork, and yes, it is made from the same. It is the same material which is used as bottle opener in wine bottles. It is sourced from cork oak trees, and the outer bark of the cork tree is cut, and which doesn't harm the tree, because actually cutting the outer bark helps the tree to live longer. So it's better for the tree and for the environment as well. It is actually a zero waste industry, because all the products which are made from cork either are made from recycled cork stoppers or directly from the cork bark. Since it has lot of air cavities, therefore it is extremely lightweight, and it is water resistant, sound resistant, thermal resistant, and fire resistant as well. And it is naturally antimicrobial.
So in terms of wood, it's often perceived as something that's warm. There's this whole nostalgia associated with it. And again, that warm that is perceived is again related to its actual physical properties, because wood is warm to the touch, and its color also, which has like an yellowish tint to it. So that also creates this perception of warmth. And then there have been like proven physiological benefits of wood, of using wood in a space. So when we use, I think there was a study about where the interior space had at least 45% of wood. So there was reduced systolic blood pressure, and there was reduced heart rate. All of these benefits have led to wood being used in schools and hospitals to see how it impacts the users there. Bamboo, again, it's another natural material, so it has all the benefits of what we would expect in natural materials. But apart from that, I think one of the very interesting things about bamboo that I can notice is from all of these structures is the complexity that it creates in terms of the shadows and the textures that it has. Because again, you're using a lot of different bamboos, and create this whole striped patterns to it. And visual complexity has been like researched, and usually people have a preference for a certain level of visual complexity. Again, it depends on the context. So if you have like something that's too visually complex in, say, an inpatient facility for individuals with schizophrenia, where they have trouble perceiving spaces. So if you have something that's ambiguous and too complex, so it can impact them. So again, we need to be mindful of how we use different materials in different spaces. Cork. Cork again is quite similar to wood. From what I've seen is that cork has this structure, like honeycomb structure in it. So that kind of dampens the sound. So it tends to create a more quieter space. It's useful for soundproofing and all of that. So it can be quite useful in spaces where you want to create that kind of an atmosphere. Also, it's something that's soft and lightweight. So unlike hardwood, it's quite soft, and so when you even walk on a cork floorboard, it tends to sort of how to say, kind of like fits. It doesn't resist your footsteps. So that again could create a sensorial experience.
It gives a bouncy experience to walk on cork
So
flooring.
yeah, thank you, Shivani. So that again engages your other senses as well and creates like a more holistic experience. And cork, as well as some like a lot of wood structures, they are associated with having like a specific aroma to it. So that again engages your olfactory senses.